One of the biggest pitfalls I've seen with podcasters is they don't build a show to actually monetize. They always think in terms of how do I become Joe Rogan famous, get a bazillion followers, get a bazillion subscribers, and then have Nike sponsor me. And the funny thing is, that's not actually the people that are making the most money that are doing that. The ones that are killing it with not having to have a 50-person team that's actually managing the show are the ones that know how to build an amazing offer and create a show that's designed to convert, not just get tons of clicks. Kevin Chemidlin is our guest on the episode today. He owns Grow the Show, which is a really awesome program that helps podcasters level up and actually build a show that converts and makes money. Again, if you're listening to the show, that's what you're here for. You don't just want to get famous. We want to actually be able to convert and make money on this. So he shares his 4-step process. He really opens up the vault here. He shares the same stuff that he's charging people tens of thousands of dollars to learn about. And he shares for free on the show. 4 steps to how he actually grows the show and kind of builds into a ladder system so that you understand that step 1 has to be completed before step 2, then step 3 and step 4 and so forth. And really just clear, concise system. Really insightful for me as well as I was listening to this. Welcome to Reach. This is a show for podcasters who are not only trying to grow an amazing show, but they actually want to make money. I'm excited to share with you the secrets that I've learned along the way, as well as introduce you to some amazing guests who are going to really help you take your show to the next level. I'm your host, Brunson Smith. Let's dive in. All right, guys, welcome back to the show. I want to welcome Kevin Chemidlin. Dude, so great having you.
Dude, the pleasure's all mine. I'm so pumped to dive in. Let's rock and roll.
So let's kind of dive into teenage years, how you got into the podcasting space and where this all started.
Yeah. So I didn't touch podcasting until 2018, which in the grand scheme of things is not that long ago. It's only, 6 years? So I was 26 at the time. And at that point, I was 4 years into a software career. I was a low-level software developer at a big health insurance company and was not super passionate about, writing insurance software at all. But I was and am super passionate about my hometown of Philadelphia. And so I just at that point had discovered podcasts as a listener for the first time. And I was like, I really, really want to hear a show that interviews and tells the stories of Philadelphia's most successful and famous people. And so I created that just as a side hustle, a side hobby. At that point in time, that was like my, I think, 6th or 7th side hustle that I thought was going to be like, my startup or my business that would rescue me from the corporate world. But that point, I had started and failed so many different ridiculous startups as a side hustle that for this podcast, I was like, okay, this is going to be the one where I'm just going to make this for fun. This is not going to be a business. I'm just going to make it. And of course, it winds up being the thing. It winds up being my thing. But essentially, the way it went was I launched the show. It got a little bit of attention right away because I shared it with a couple of email lists of Philadelphia entrepreneurs and startup founders. And I pulled the trigger on leaving my job right away. I was like, awesome. My podcast got 200 downloads. That means that I'm the best podcaster ever. I'm so ready to not be in the corporate world. So let me just do this full time and then I'll turn it into a business. Made, tons of fanfare, posted all over social media, told everybody in my life that I was leaving a 6-figure software job to be a podcaster, which again, 2018, people did not know podcasts then. Now I say I'm a podcaster and people are like, oh, that's really cool. Back then they're like, what? What is that? So left the corporate job, was like, yes, I'm doing it. I'm a full-time, and again, full-time creator. We say that now, but that wasn't something that people said back then. And so it was fun at first. I spent the whole summer, running around interviewing people, Philadelphians that I never dreamed I would ever get to talk to, let alone talk to them for, 2-3 hours with their full attention. But the problem was I didn't understand how to systematically grow the audience, like how to have a system for audience growth. And also I had no idea how to actually make money. I thought, yeah, I'll probably, get sponsors, which is what most people think when it comes to podcasts. What I didn't realize then is that sponsorship is probably the last way that you should monetize a show. So 6 months into entrepreneurship, I found myself completely out of savings, back was against the wall. The show had not grown, still had no idea how I was going to make any money. I'd gone into debt. It's totally ill-advised. I don't recommend doing it this way. And I remember when I left the job, my boss said, he was like, he was like, because what's funny is in the insurance world, there's like a handful of really big insurance companies. So when somebody tells their boss that they're quitting, 9 times out of 10, they're moving to one of the other like 5 health insurance companies. So he was like, oh man, okay, where are you going? Which company is it? And I'm like, actually, I'm going to be a podcaster. And he like gave me this funny look. And he's one of the best leaders I've ever, come across. He was just the man. And he kind of, for a minute, looked surprised, but then he was like, that is awesome. Let us know what you need. But also, you always have a home here. So he was like, if you ever need, your job back, let me know. So 6 months in, I had my phone up and I had his name up and I was about to call him, ask for my job back. But I had made such a big stink to everybody in my life about being a
Right.
full-time entrepreneur that I was like, all right, let me just give this one more crack. And so I put the show on hold. I paused it. I like broke the consistency rule. Every podcaster knows you got to be consistent, never miss a week. I said, screw this. I'm publishing to the same 100 people every single week. So they can chill for a month while I figure this out. And what I did was I spent a weekend. I listened to every single podcast on the top 100 charts just to listen. What are they doing? How are they monetized? What do they sound like? How are the episodes packaged? Noticed they were doing things a lot differently than I was. I took a couple courses on sales, on marketing, went to a conference. I managed to get in touch with a few big name podcasters to ask them for advice. And like, this was like a 4 to 6 week period. And through all of that, I was like, oh, damn, I'm really not marketing the show at all. Number one, like I'm expecting to just post episodes and then it'll just work, right? Like if you build it, they will come. With podcasting,
Right.
that is so not the case. So I learned what actually works to grow a show. I learned how the biggest podcasts had truly monetized, and it wasn't straight up sponsorships. Again, sponsorships like the last one brought my Philly show back. And within 12 months, so the year 2019, I did 120K in revenue from the show, and the show had surpassed 100,000 downloads. And, I basically lived off the show full time. And so that was kind of like my entry into the podcasting world.
Between the pause when you took the break and you cleared that number, what was that? What was the time gap?
Yeah, so I took the break. I took the break for
Uh-huh.
6 weeks. I brought the show back, and 12 months after bringing the show back, I did 120,000 in revenue through direct merchandise sales, live events, indeed some sponsorships, a few like consulting gigs, and there were a handful of other little tiny, little monetization opportunities that came up. But the big one was sponsorships and live events and selling merch. And I said before that sponsorship should be the last one. It was, and I can expand on that. But yeah, the show did 6 figures, and it was just me. I didn't have any employees. So, for
That's
that year,
amazing.
I just I was living the 4-hour work week life. Yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then after that, 2020, COVID happened. We were all sitting at home, and I found myself spending my days just like talking with other podcasters who saw what I did with the Philly show, and were like, "How did you do this? How did you grow it? How did you monetize it?" And it's just like all day, I was getting on the phone with people, teaching them stuff, and I was like, I think there's something here. I think there's a way I can make a larger impact, and that's how Grow the Show was born.
Oh, that's so cool. Well, so this bleeds into a couple of questions as you were talking. One of them that I think would be really interesting for our listeners is, you said you listened to some of the top 100 shows, right? And you're trying to dissect how are they doing what they're doing. This is a question that I'm kind of curious about. What percentage of podcasters, even the famous ones, are actually making a killing? I mean, if you were to take the top 100 shows, what out of those top 100, do you think, if you were to put a number on it, just based on your experience now, your understanding, what number of those are probably actually clearing, let's say 200,000 a year?
I mean, probably like 0.0001. Now, keep in mind, there are pretty much anybody who publishes a podcast right now has in their Instagram bio that they're a top 1% podcaster. And that's because there's listen notes, which says top 1%. But that's on all 3 million podcasts that have ever existed. Right. Literally, only 10% of the podcasts that have ever existed are publishing right now. 90% of those 3 million podcasts are done. They have not published an episode. They still exist on Apple, but they've either given up or they've stopped, which is really the same thing. So top 1% of all podcasts ever, yes, but really it's the top 1% of the top 1% that get most of the attention and the money. Because if you look, like if you ask any podcast listener, what shows do you listen to? They're going to say the same ones. They're going to say the Joe Rogans, the Call You Dadders, the Tim Ferrisses, all that stuff. So there's like I said, it's like the 1% of the 1% of the 1% when it comes to podcasting that are quote unquote making a killing. Now, there is a very small middle class of folks like I was with Philly who yes, they have basically a small business. They're doing, 5-6 figures a year from their show, but that's really, really rare. The vast majority, it's either you've got the handful of shows that everybody's heard of that make millions and they get millions, Then there's a very tiny middle class, and then the vast majority of podcasts are top 1%, quote unquote, but really they generally have about 100 to 200 downloads per episode, and it's pretty much just their friends and family listening.
Right. Well, and this is something that I really want to put a note on for our listeners, is that the big conception, I think, and I'm sure you can speak on this a ton, is everyone thinks they want to be Joe Rogan. And I'm kind of going, well, are you sure? Do you want to have this be 4 hours a day of just insane production? And yes, I'm sure he makes a killing, but to get where he's at and try to catch up to him, good luck. So there's another strategy where it's like, you don't need to be the biggest. And you also don't need to be the guy that's not making money. There's maybe a way to be, locally famous and still crush it and make more than some of these even giant shows.
Oh, 100%. I mean, and that's literally what my whole business is built around, is helping to show people this, not only that this is possible and how to do it. Because yes, it's locally famous, not necessarily like for some people, local in like an actual physical sense, like it's like my Philly show.
Yeah.
But local can also mean local to a community online, local to a specific niche, a specific demographic or psychographic. And it's totally doable.
Yeah.
And the key is it's those people who are not trying to be Joe Rogan that achieve that, because what they understand is that in podcasting, it's not about having the biggest, like there's really two ways that you can do it. You can go for broke, go for the biggest audience. And what most people who look at Joe Rogan don't understand is, number one, that he has been podcasting since like 2008, which is, podcasting the word was invented in 2004. Nobody knew what a podcast was until like the vast majority of people listening to my voice right now found out about podcasts between 2014 and 2019. And, Joe Rogan had already been at it for 10 years, right? So he was already top. He was already on top. So the vast majority of people, of podcast listeners, discovered the medium between 2014 and 2019. And at that point, Joe Rogan was already on top. So all those newcomers just went to him. And that doesn't take away anything from, the dude is a businessman. The dude has grinded, of course.
For sure.
But what they also overlook is the fact that Joe Rogan was the host of Fear Factor for 10 years. He's a stand-up comedian for 20, 30 years. Like, he's been doing this stuff. Like, this is the culmination of a 30 to 40-year career. And so they're like, oh, I want to be Joe Rogan next year, right? And I have no audience. I don't know what I want to talk about, right? It's like, okay, you can try, but it's going to be very difficult to compete with that. What if instead you got really specific behind who your show is for and what it is going to do for them? Got really specific behind that, which may or may not involve niching down from a demographic perspective. Everybody thinks, I need to niche down. Maybe. But what you do want to do is get really specific on the problem that your show solves for its listeners, what your show is there to do for them. And when you can do that, it becomes way easier to grow the show, and it becomes way easier to monetize the show, because that's when you're able to generate 6, sometimes even 7 figures in income, which I have a few clients who are at the 7-figure mark, and their show gets 2,000, maybe 3,000 downloads per episode, which, for someone who's listening who's at 100 thinks that sounds like a lot, but it's really not compared to the Joe Rogans who get literally 2 to 3 million downloads per episode. But from a dollar per download perspective, meaning how much money are you making for every download that you get, the best ratio is generally in that like middle class of shows that I was telling you about.
That's awesome. Well, and I think that's just spot on what you're saying. That's the big misconception in podcasting. Everyone thinks I need to become the biggest, get lots of sponsors, and then all of a sudden all my problems go away. What do you think is I saw you post this on LinkedIn, but I'd love for you to speak on it. What's the big issue with sponsors? What have you kind of run into with people who try to just grow an enormous show and then go to sponsors?
Yeah, so that's the first issue, is that in order to make significant sponsorship revenue where it's worth your time to consider, like to find sponsors, pitch them, sell them, record the commercial, keep the sponsors happy, which is something that everyone overlooks. They're like, yay, I got paid, I got a sponsor. And then they never talk to the sponsor again. And then that sponsor's like, what the hell, and then they don't renew as a sponsor. So, finding, selling, closing, and fulfilling sponsorships in and of itself for a podcast is a full-time job. So number one, they think sponsorship is easy. It's great. I just get paid. I just talk about it. No, it's a full-time job. Number two, sponsorship, in order for you to make significant sponsorship revenue where it's worth your time to do all those things and you are able to pay the expenses of your podcast, let alone make a profit, you do need to get a significant audience size. And that's because when most people think sponsorships, they think CPM sponsorship, cost per mil, which is fancy advertisement speak for you get paid in advance for the sponsorship. really, right? So like a sponsorship is going to say, hey, I will pay you $1,000 to talk about my product on your show. And you're like, great, I get paid, which by the way, you don't usually get paid until like 90 days after the ad runs. So that always sucks. But, you get paid just to talk about it. It's amazing, right? I don't even need to get people to buy the thing, which is very short-term thinking. But again, like if you're doing the show, a podcast, the other misconception that people have is that podcasting is easy. Well, you just turn on a microphone and talk. Creating a good podcast that actually gets attention and gets strangers to tune in week after week is tremendous work. It is a lot, right? It is a lot to do. It is a lot to create the show. It is a lot to think about. It's a lot to market the show. It is a full-time job. So in order for you to get paid enough for you to spend all of this time doing this thing, you need a really, really significant audience size in order for sponsorship dollars to make sense. So that is probably the biggest misconception. The other misconception is that if you have that large of an audience where it does make sense, where you are making thousands of dollars on sponsors, you're going to make even more thousands of dollars if you sell something that you make to that audience. So everyone defaults to, oh, I'm going to build this huge audience and then I'm just going to sell other businesses' products. But you get such a small cut of that, right? You get such a small
Right.
amount of the sales that you are generating for that company. Whereas if you instead sell that listenership something directly, you're able to make way more money from your time. And the other thing that I'll add is that a lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to grow this show to the point where it makes sense for me to have sponsors, where it makes sense for me to quote unquote monetize, because they think that monetization equals sponsorship. But the problem is your show is going to require financial investment to grow to that size, to grow to the size where you are making the sponsorship dollars that you want. Now, I'm not saying that you can't get any sponsors early on. There are people who get sponsors before a show even launches. What I'm talking about is significant recurring sponsorship revenue that you can bank on every single month, right? That pays your bills, that pays you, and that's coming through every single month. Yes, you can have a few one-offs here and there. You can get a buddy who has a company, like sure. But I'm talking like truly, this is my full-time gig type money. That doesn't come from sponsorships until after you are already working on the show full-time and you're investing money in addition to your time, right? So it's not, I need to grow the show so that I can get sponsors, so that I can make money. It's, I need to make money so that I can grow this show.
Right. I love that. And I think that's the big paradigm shift. Every industry has one, or every industry has something where you walk in and you think, oh, if I build it, they will come, or, some of those different sentiments. And in podcasting, that's it. It's all about sponsors. It's all about, and people often ask me that, well, how many sponsors do you have? And I'm like, 0. And I don't know if I ever will have any, because on top of it, they often censor you. Like a lot of them, like I want to share a story about Nike.
True.
But Adidas is my sponsor. All of a sudden I can't share that story anymore. And they're going to come back and say, hey, well, you can't
100%.
talk about that. We need to pull the episode, and it's just a giant mess. So no, that's awesome. So for those that are trying to go, okay, we're bought in now. They're kind of on the Kevin train going, okay, this makes a lot of sense. I don't want to do that path. What is the alternative? And do you have any kind of a framework for how they can actually grow a show that makes money, that doesn't need to be Joe Rogan famous?
100%. My framework is called the podcast ladder. There are 4 rungs on the podcast ladder. And the idea is, picture a ladder. There's 4 rungs on it, and you have to step on each rung to get to the top. And what is at the top? A podcast that has grown and is making you money. Basically, a successful podcast. Level 1 on the podcast ladder is having a clear, unique premise. What does that mean? A premise is basically, what is your show about? What is your podcast about? And there's 2 ingredients to it, clear and unique. CUP, clear, unique premise. Number 1, ideally, the show is unique. What we don't want to do is create another Joe Rogan podcast. We don't want to create yet another 45-minute interview show that interviews successful millionaires on how they got where they are. There are so many of those, right? We want a unique value proposition where you can truthfully say, this is the only podcast on the planet that is the unique combination of these 3 things, right? So you get to take 3 things. The 3 things individually don't need to be unique, but the combination of those 3 things is unique. And those 3 things are who the show is for, specifically your audience. 2, what the show will do for them, which is your listener mission. I call that your listener mission. Note that that's not what you are going to do as the podcaster. It's not, I am going to interview millionaires. It's you, the listener, are going to learn how to become a millionaire, right? So what the show will do for the listener. And then 3 is the format. How are we delivering this? Everybody defaults to 45-minute interviews. Interviews are great. Most people are average interviewers. By just math, most people are average. Podcast listeners do not want to listen to average interviews. So am I saying that you shouldn't do interviews? No, I'm saying you should not default to interviews, right? If you do decide to do interviews, you need to learn the craft. You need to decide that you are going to get better at this skill. But other things that people overlook are solo episodes, which these days absolutely crush, where it's the host sharing a story, sharing their unique perspective, sharing their expertise. Those do really, really well. They're way more efficient to make, and they hold people's attention better. And then there's other, creative formats that you can get as well. But really, interviewing and solo episodes are the two ones. So you start with a premise. Number one, ideally, it's the unique combination of who the show is for, your audience, what it will do for them, the show's mission, and how it will do that, which is their format, AMF, audience mission format. And you also need it to be clear. There are some podcasters and business owners that I come across who have a show, and the core of what they're talking about is really unique. It is something that is like, wow, this is awesome. But they're talking about the show's packaging, the show's name, its description, right? How they're talking about it is super vague, and it doesn't really get to the core value that the show is there to provide. Let me give you an example of that. I'm currently working with a client. Her name is Danielle. She owns a bookkeeping service business, right? So her clients hire her company to do their bookkeeping for them. What Danielle noticed, though, is that these entrepreneurs and these CEOs that her company serves, they get their bookkeeping data back and they don't know what it means. They don't know how to read it. They don't know how to make decisions based on data. And when I spoke with Danielle, she was like, I want to create a show that helps CEOs and entrepreneurs look at their financial data and make great business decisions from it. I'm like, that's awesome, right? Like, we need that, right? There's so many entrepreneurs who are making emotional decisions and have no idea how to read their numbers. So I said, okay, great. What is your podcast that is here to do that? She said, it's called Entrepreneur Money Stories, where we interview entrepreneurs about their money mindset. I'm like, what does that have to do? I'm sure Danielle would be okay with me sharing this. I'm like, what happened to what you just told me the show is there to do, right? That says nothing about what you want the show to do for its listeners. That sounds super vague. It doesn't sound interesting, right? And to me, it sounds like I'm going to hear entrepreneurs talk about their limiting beliefs. I'm not really sure, right? So I said, Danielle, we don't really even need to change anything about your growth strategy or your monetization strategy. It's literally, your premise is not clear. It's really vague. Like what you're telling people the show is, that's not what it is. That's not a great show. So we did a little work together and she rebranded it from Entrepreneur Money Stories to Business by the Books, the podcast that helps you read your financial data and make great business decisions. I'm in, right? If you're an entrepreneur listening to my voice right now, you're like, damn, what was that called? I'm going to have to look that up. I really need that, right? It's the same show, right? It's still interviewing entrepreneurs about how they make decisions with money, but just by changing the packaging and the premise of the show, already people are going to be like, wow, I want to check that out. So that's level 1 of the podcast ladder. And I went super deep into that one because it's the most important. Does that make sense?
Totally.
So the premise one, I spent the most time in that one because that's the one that most people don't think about and is literally the most important. Like I said, this framework is a ladder. And I've had people come to me who have levels 2, 3, and 4 locked in, but level 1, they do not have locked in. So they have the results as if they're at level 0, right? So you can't skip a level and you have the results of the lowest level that you have not gotten, if that makes sense. So once you have a clear, unique premise, level 2 is retention, right? It's not growth. It's when people discover my show, when they press play on an episode, do they listen to the whole episode? Does your show keep the listeners that it gets? The vast majority of the show, the answer is no. And if your podcasts are hearing my voice and you've never looked at your episode completion rates before, which you can get in your Apple Podcast dashboard, I'm willing to bet your show is not keeping listeners. People who do not have level 2 locked in think they have a growth problem, but they have a retention problem. It's not that you can't get people in the door, but you can't get them to stay long enough to listen to your full episodes. Your show is not delivering on the promise that it makes, or the most common is that it has a really bad episode intro. And just a quick story, there was a client that I worked with. His name is Nate Palmer. He has a podcast called Low Carb Hustle. When he came to me, the show was stuck at 12,000 downloads per month, which is impressive. But what's crazy is that this dude was throwing every single growth strategy around at the show. He was showing up on other podcasts. He was crushing, like he had so many posts on social media. He was even running paid ads. He was running paid spend to the show, and he could not get past 12,000 downloads per month. I said, all right, Nate, come on, let's take a look at this. I pressed play on his episode, and immediately I was like, I know what to do. Because as soon as I pressed play, he was like, "What's up? You're listening to Low Carb Hustle. I'm here with Juicy Cheeks. Juicy Cheeks, how was your week?" I'm like, "Who's Juicy Cheeks? Who are you? What does Juicy Cheeks' week have to do with me losing weight?" Right? And
Right.
it was like 5 minutes of dumb small talk. And again, Nate would totally be cool with me sharing this. And it was like, dude,
Right.
this is horrible. You're paying ads. You're getting all these people to press play on the show. And what are your completion rates? He looked and it was like 20% on average. So on average, literally across all the listeners who were tuning in, they were listening to 20% of the episode, which is really bad. We want to shoot for 60 to 70%. But most of the people were turning it off right away because it just was so cringy. I said, dude, all you need to do is craft a 60-second intro where you say, what are we going to talk about in this episode? What is the listener going to get from listening to this episode? How's it going to impact their life? And if you have a guest, why should they listen to that person? That's it. That's all you need to do. So he did that. His next episode, he was like, "Hey, I just recorded this intro. How is this?" I was like, "Dude, this is awesome." He fixed just his intro, and within 3 months, his show was at 36,000 downloads per month. His show 3x'd
Wow.
in 3 months just by fixing his intro. And that's because he had level 3, which is growth, going. Like he had it maxed out, but level 2 was horrible. So he had the results of as if he was only at level 1. As soon as he got level 2 locked in and he learned how to keep the listeners that he was getting, boom, he jumped up to level 3 because he already had that level locked in, right? Today, he's at 75 to 100,000 dollars per month. It's been about a year since we worked together. And again, just from fixing his retention. I was like, dude, you don't have a growth problem. You have a retention problem. You can't keep the people in the door. So that's level 2. Real quick, level 3 is growth. There's 3 main ways to grow a podcast today in 2024. Way number 1 is by getting organic social media reach. Way number 2 is doing what I am doing right now, which is being a guest on other podcasts. And way number 3 is if you are doing video, learning how to do YouTube, right? Learning how to grow a audience on YouTube because YouTube has an incredible algorithm. Basically, if you're a podcaster, you're like, oh, okay, wow, I should do all of those. If you're not doing any of them, pick one, focus on that one. You can always add the others later. And then finally, level 4 is monetization. And I get the question all the time. How can I monetize my podcast? Horrible question. Because at what moment is your podcast monetized? What does that even mean, right? And I say, okay, at what moment is your podcast monetized? What would you say?
Well, for most people, it'd be well when I'm getting paid by sponsors, right?
Okay. So let's unpack that real quick. When I am getting paid, correct. And then the next question I say is, who is paying you? And people say sponsors. I say, okay, let me ask you this: who's paying your sponsors?
And it's the marketing department, or they have an allocated budget that comes from the customers, right? So, yeah, from customers.
The customers, right? So who do they want to become their customers? Your listeners, right?
Listeners.
Now, the other way you can monetize a podcast is by people be like, oh, I could sell a course. I could sell merch. I could sell stuff. Okay, cool. And who's buying that stuff? Your listeners. So in either case, whether it's you selling your own stuff or you getting sponsorships, who's buying stuff? Your listeners. So the moment that your podcast is monetized is when you get your listeners to buy something. It is the moment that you convert your listeners into customers of something. It can be of your thing that you make and you sell to them, or another company's thing, aka sponsorships and affiliates. So that's the 4th step is you get your listeners to buy something that you get a cut of. That is it. Literally every single form of podcast monetization is either you sell something directly to your listeners or your sponsors sell something directly to your listeners, and your sponsors are just basically paying you a cut in advance, right? So if you're like, how do I monetize this podcast? A better question to ask yourself is, what do my listeners want to buy? What can I get them to buy that I can get a cut of, whether I sell it to them or whether through a sponsor? And that's it. At that point, you've got your 4 levels. You've got a clear, unique premise. You know how to keep the listeners that you get because your show makes a promise and it keeps it, and you have great episode intros. You're growing the show in one of those 3 ways: social media, YouTube, or podcast guesting, or all 3 if you're Nate. And you're monetized because your listeners are buying something that you get a cut of. And at that point, bada bing. Your show is growing. Every single month, you get more listeners. Every single month, you get more money. And then you've made it.
I love that. Now, we're kind of maxed out on time, so I want to give you a little space here because for those that are listening going, okay, I'm bought in. I love what you've got going on. How can they take the next step, work with you, connect with you? What's the best approach?
Yeah, I appreciate you giving me the chance to say that. So basically, I just blew through the podcast ladder. Really, it's true. I convey it in a way that's very simple. But the truth of the matter is it's simple to talk about, complicated to execute on. And so, and there's also way more to it than what I could say in 5 minutes. So I'm actually doing an event called Grow the Show Live. It's going to be a remote event. It's going to be 5 days. And depending on when this episode comes out, it's basically the event is April 1st through April 5th. So if this does come out before that, then you can just go to growtheshowlive.com and you can register for that. It's a $97 event. It's, like I said, 5 days. And the goal of the event is to dive deeper into the 4 levels of the podcast ladder, right? Day 1, we're going to go into how you can actually create a unique premise. Day 2 is retention. Day 3 is growth. Day 4 is monetization. And day 5 will kind of wrap things up. So, if you're somebody's listening and you're like, wow, I really want to go deeper into that, that's the number one thing, is to join us over in Grow the Show Live next week, April 1st. And if that's not for you, then literally just listen to any episode of my podcast, which is called Grow the Show. So wherever you're listening to my voice right now, just search Grow the Show Kevin. Pick literally any episode, and I promise you, you will learn something that you can implement today to grow and monetize your show.
That's awesome. Well, Kevin, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing all those great insights. I'm always really grateful when guests come on the show and they just give away the best stuff for free, right? I mean, you didn't hold back. I always appreciate that. So I hope everyone was listening really closely. I mean, that was just straight gold that we got there. Thanks for coming on the show, Kevin.
My pleasure. Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode. I'm so grateful for your support. If anything on this show was valuable to you, I have one huge ask. That's just share it with your friends. And if you have a little extra time, go ahead and leave me a review. That's my big ask for you guys. We'll see you on the next episode.